taking time out on your Valentine's Day to be here with us and to spread a different kind of love for each other, and a desire to get to know each other better and to build bridges between communities. Our topic today is one that's really important, is history. And honestly, if you don't know your history, you really can't know who you are or where you're going. And we had two speakers gracious enough to agree to present for us today and talk to us and to start the discussion. And I don't know they're going to speak in this order. I'm just going to introduce real quickly. I know Dana Herman is one of the few speakers that we've had that I can actually say I've eaten in her house before. When I was visiting Cincinnati a couple years ago. She's been at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati since 2005. Her husband, Jason, is also one of my favorite, you don't have to tell him he's one of my favorite, was one of my favorite professors in rabbinical school.
And McGill grads, you said.
And McGill
grads.
Along with Laurent Duvernay Tardif. But so she's going to be talking about the Jewish perspective on archiving and preserving our history. And also John Edwards, who's here representing the Bessie Smith Cultural Center, and also the Chattanooga, I think I wrote this down right, the Chattanooga Chronicle?
Chattanooga News Chronicle, yes.
Chattanooga News Chronicle, okay. And I don't know if you guys have any particular order you want to speak in. I'm just thrilled to have you here, and
happy to be here.
Okay, well, good. Let's go.
John, if you want to take a stab at it, John, you go right ahead.
Well, I can do that. You want to talk a little bit about history? You just mentioned, I think, Craig, right?
Yeah.
Craig, about, if you don't know your history, you don't know where you're going, and you don't know what you have the potential to be. Growing up, and I can testify, being 73 years old, I was still, I could still see the black and white fountains, white only, when I was a kid. And, there was very little as far as African Americans on TV. And if you can't see yourself as somebody, if you don't see yourself in any roles or have any role models, it's hard to imagine that what you can be. So there was very few African Americans on TV, and if they were in small roles, like cleaning up and janitors and what have you. But you rarely saw any positive roles. That has improved over the years. I read Carter G. Woodson. I know y'all familiar with Carter G. Woodson, who is considered the father of African American history. He 11 years before he initiated the Black History Month, it was Negro History Month, Negro History Week, I'm sorry. And he started, 11 years before that, he started the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Afro-American Life and History. And it was his purpose to start that because African Americans had been left out of history books for years. I mean, since the early centuries. And there was a lot of reasons for that. Of course, you had to, slavery was a key, and people had to try to justify slavery so that you didn't want to see anything positive about African Americans. And then books came into play. If you wanted to sell a book, you couldn't put anything in there positive about African Americans, especially if you want to sell that book in the South. So it was very difficult for African Americans who had made accomplishments to be viewed or be talked about in any kind of a literature. But of course, now we have the internet and we have TV, and I don't know if you've noticed about the diversity on TV. It's just phenomenal now. You see it in your commercials, is just awesome. I mean, you see Black history all over, you know, in sports and different venues. Everybody's talking about African American history now. So that's a change. But the thing that strikes me is one of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's one of his hopes was that by starting Negro History Week, which eventually became African American History Month, that we would, as ethnic groups, would come together and respect each other's contributions collectively. And by that, we would come closer together and have a better understanding that we've all have made contributions to this country. Just a short story. I had an exhibit a few years ago when the mall first opened out at Hamilton Place, and there were a lot of space still available. And the Mary Walker Foundation, which is a historical organization that promotes reading through history and African American exhibits, we had an exhibit out there, and we actually filled up about 1,500 feet of space with different kinds of African American exhibits, and one was on Civil War, on the African Americans in the Civil War. So I was driving downtown one day, and I was in front of one of the banks. I can't recall which one it was, but a white male came out and he saw the van that I was riding in, and it had the Mary Walker insignia on it. He said, "Aren't y'all the ones who have the exhibit out at the mall?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I didn't know that African Americans had anything to do with the Civil War, that they even participated." And he said, "Now I know that, and I have the utmost respect for a lot of the contributions they made." And then when I heard that, I thought of what Carter G. Woodson was talking about, and that I was a part of that, of his dream of making that a reality, that by telling our history, that people would see that and then have a better understanding and more respect for African American contributions. And if there are any other questions, you know, I can answer.
Well, we're going to definitely do some Q&A. I think if you could just tell us a little bit about the work that you're currently doing right now, maybe, and
Well, I publish a local African American newspaper. That's what I primarily do now. That's what I do for a living. We work into our 32nd year. We've twice been Minority Business of the Year. And it's primarily a family business, my son and my wife, and we have 5 employees. We also cover a lot of history. You know, yesterday's news is history. And we have a historical section every week on African Americans. And I am a chairman of the Mary Walker Historical and Educational Foundation. And as I mentioned before, that we promote literacy. Mary Walker was a literacy through our historical events. Mary Walker was a former slave who lived to read and write at the age of 117. And she was proclaimed the oldest student in the United States of America. And she lived right here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we decided to use her as a inspiration for reading, because she said once she learned how to read, even though she was 117, this was the most satisfying part of her life. She could read now. And if you don't realize, the only way you could keep slaves or control the slave is to keep him ignorant. And that was not being able to read and write was one of the main things. That's why we find so many stories where slaves escaped to freedom. The first thing they did was learn how to read and write so they could navigate the things that where they were going, the things that they needed to do. Reading was so important. So all of our exhibits are designed to encourage reading. We have a collection of periodicals and books from back in the day, you know, that shows African Americans beginning as negative images all the way up to positive images. Hank Aaron and Michael Jordan on the front of Wheaties boxes, and on and on. And we talk about the history of certain of these people. You know, people like Aunt Jemima, whose actually name was Nancy Green, and she was actually the first, really paid model on a box representing, a product. And but for years they had her as, she was actually a pretty woman, but for years they had her looking, not very, very beautiful. But we tell the little known facts in history, and a lot of it centers around the antebellum period, centers around slavery, even the contributions of ex-slaves. One of our better exhibits is African American inventions. It's called Bright Ideas. African Americans who contributed their inventions, even some during slavery. Just how strong the mind is, and how they even contributed to this nation, things that we take advantage of today. Our last week we had in our Black History section, we had a slave named Onesimus, who is responsible for the process or passing that process on to the United States, inoculation. So we know what that means now when we talk about COVID. But there was a smallpox epidemic in New England, and everybody was, they were afraid, just like we are now, COVID. But he told his master, I think it was Cotton Mather, who was a religious figure, that he had smallpox, but he was cured of it when they took the disease from a person and cut his skin and rubbed it in him. And nobody could believe that, but they tried it and it worked. And from that point, they were able to control smallpox. So, had it not been for that, it eventually morphed into inoculation instead of rubbing it directly into the skin. But there's so many contributions of African Americans that we have not heard of. And that's one of our most popular exhibits. Of course, we have African Americans in the Civil War. In Chattanooga is probably the most second important Civil War city after Gettysburg. And when you look at the contributions of African Americans here, before the Civil War, there were only 490 something African Americans in Chattanooga. Most of them were, domestic workers. Some were skilled laborers and carpenters. But after the Civil War, you had 6,000 because they had come here from other places as escaped slaves and free men who came to Chattanooga and were put on the north side of the river as at Camp Contraband. Those people many of them were mustered into the Civil War in 1863. And after the Civil War, they became citizens of Chattanooga. At one point, they outnumbered the white community. But these people many of them who learned, and I'm closing, many of them who learned by working in the commissary. At first they weren't allowed to fight, but the Union Army had a large commissary downtown where they worked, and they learned business principles. And through these principles, they were able to open businesses after Civil War. Thus, you have 9th Street and Main Street with a lot of African-American businesses. And that was the beginning. They built churches like First Baptist Church, 8th Street. So that was the beginning of the African-American community.
Thank you so much. I
want to add a thank you to John, because he and I together have been friends for a long time, and he has honored me in the past by publishing some of my work, because we've had a Black-Jewish dialogue together. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
John, I have one quick question before I let Dana then kind of share a different perspective. Is something that I find very interesting, a thread of what you keep talking about, is that, it's not just about the preservation. It sounds like a lot of the focus is to sort of unearth, or at least reveal, these stories that have been otherwise ignored by history. And so that the voice that has been silenced or stifled actually it gets allowed to be heard.
Correct. I hope one day that we will have, not just when we look at our history books, we won't have, especially the ones that we use in school, we won't just have a section of African-American history, but African-American history is American history, and the whole book will encompass American history and as African-American history as well.
May I ask John a question?
Can we go ahead and let Dana, I want to make sure that we
Okay.
get speakers in, and then we'll
Okay.
just open it up for questions, if that's okay.
Okay, then.
If you
Okay,
want to
very
type
good.
into
Thank
chat
you.
too, we can.
I'll chat it, put it in the chat because I'm going to go off, but because I wanted to make
Oh,
sure.
that's
But
right.
I'll
She has to go. She has to go.
Oh, okay. If you
Yeah.
have to go ahead real quickly, and then we'll let Dana.
John, could you share the phrase "the real McCoy" where it came from?
Real McCoy, that was a Elijah McCoy, was educated in Europe, and when he came back to the United States, he couldn't get a job as a engineer. So he worked on a train where he was shoveling coal in a steam engine and that was, pushing the motor. But every so often he had to stop and oil the mechanical parts of the locomotive. You had to do that with all machinery in the United States. And he figured out a way to invent an automatic lubricating cup. And when you attach this lubricating cup, it automatically oiled the moving pieces. And it was a phenomenal invention because it changed industry all over the country. You no longer had to stop every now and then and oil mechanical parts. They could continue to move. And it was so popular that when people went to sell it, the buyer would ask, "Is this the real McCoy?" And it became, it represented the genuine article. And that's where the term came from.
Never knew that.
I did not know that either.
All right. So thank you, John, and look forward to hearing you get a chance to answer some other questions here in a moment. Dana, let me know when you want those slides to come up, and I'll start playing them.
As a transition to what John was talking about, with the wonderful recitation of her poetry that Amanda Gorman delivered at the inauguration, I was reflecting on that, and I revisited Maya Angelou's delivery of her poem on the pulse of morning that she spoke at Bill Clinton's inauguration. And she had these words about history in particular. She said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And I think to your point, Craig, at the beginning, you said, we have to know where we're coming from. We have to know our history. We have to understand the past so that we don't make the same mistakes again, and that we move on
in the closet,
progress and improve our condition in this country.
Pull it out.
And I think, an archive like the American Jewish Archives helps people to do that. We not only preserve the American Jewish past, but more importantly, I think we can serve as a resource and a guide for people wanting to learn more about their past. So I'm really grateful to be here, and thank Craig and Deborah for the opportunity. This is the first time that I'm giving a tour. Usually I like to give tours at the archives. I give them quite regularly, but I haven't really been at the archives now for about a year. So this is my first virtual tour of the archives, and I thought I put together a few images that Craig will show you because, most people, I imagine, have not stepped foot in an archive. It's a beautiful building. I invite all of you, whenever you're in Cincinnati, if you're ever in the Queen City in Ohio, to please come and visit us when we're permitted to visit in person. And I'd be happy to give you a tour of our facility and to talk more about our history and the history of our founder, Dr. Marcus. It's just a remarkable building and place.
There's also a plaque in the academic building that says Craig Lewis slept here.
Our other claim to fame. Yes, thank you. So I'm not going to talk too much, but I wanted to take a few seconds to show, just maybe kind of go through slowly the images and let people see, because you actually might have questions about kind of the workings of an archive. So this is literally our emblem, our, the American Jewish Archives. It's on the carpet as you walk in. But go ahead to the next slide. This is the exterior of the building. It's on the campus of Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Rabbinical Seminary that started in Cincinnati in 1875 by Isaac Mayer Wise. This is the top left image, is an extension that was built and dedicated in 2005. So it's all one big building now, and it comprises both the kind of archives with its repository and our wonderful historical room, and then the new section, which is administrative offices and an educational center and a lovely lobby area that's going to be developed into a whole state-of-the-art exhibit on American Jewish history and the importance of archiving. Next slide. Here I said I wasn't going to be talking too much, and yet I'm talking. These are some images of our founder, Dr. Marcus, who started at Hebrew Union College as a student in the early 20th century, and then earned his PhD in Germany in the 1920s, and returned and also was ordained a rabbi, and then came back to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and taught on the faculty for 7 decades. So there are many rabbis in the field today who were taught by Dr. Marcus. For many, many years, his students were his boys. Of course, they were only boys up until 1970. There were some female students from time to time at the college, but the first female rabbi ordained was in 1972. Her name was Rabbi Sally Priesand. She is thankfully still with us. She's retired now. And we're going to be celebrating, actually, we're coming up on her 50th anniversary of her ordination. But to my point, Dr. Marcus, had a lot of sons for many years. So he would call his students his boys, and they loved him dearly. So you just see some images here of a young Marcus and then an older Marcus. He died in 1995. A few months shy of his 100th birthday. And he was working on American Jewish history, writing of American Jewish history right up almost until the end. And of course, Rabbi Ken Cantor, who was the rabbi in Chattanooga years before Craig, was one of Dr. Marcus's students, and was really like a son to him, and took very good care of him in his later years.
They used to always share a room at conventions too.
Oh, if you ever have a chance to talk to Rabbi Cantor about Dr. Marcus, he has wonderful stories to tell you. All right, next one. So this is just some interior shots of the building. And then on the right is an image of our reading room, which is where all of the action happens at the archives. Meaning the researchers who want to study American Jewish history will come and use our material. Our material, when I say our material, I mean primary source documents, archival records, dating back to the beginnings of the American Jewish community, and that goes back to 1654. So we have records that are from the 17th century, all the way up to the present time. We are continually receiving more material. In fact, I would say this year was a bumper crop of a year for material, because I think a lot of people were home and with nothing to do but go through their closets and their attics and send us historic documents. So we've actually been quite busy this year. And so we really do collect all sorts of paper documents and electronic documents and photographs and audiovisual material that really speak to the history of the American Jew at the organizational level, but really also at the local level, the personal level. So we have family papers and papers of organizations and of movements. So really any professor or layperson, you know, doing genealogy or wanting to write a book in American Jewish history, or really writing anything on American history, and they want to look at the Jewish involvement in that period or in that event, then they necessarily need to come to the American Jewish Archives, because we are a national archive. We collect the records of all of American Jewry, not just, you know, Cincinnati Jews or the Jews of Ohio or the Jews of the Midwest, but really all of the entire nation. There's only one other archive like ours in the United States, and that's the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. And it predates our archive. Our archive was established in 1947. The American Jewish Historical Society goes back to 1892. So it's one of the oldest ethnic archives in the United States. So this is our lovely reading room. And then you get a sneak peek into our repository, which is where all the documents are held in our state-of-the-art repository. We have 4 floors of this compact shelving that you see on the top left behind us standing there. The red-headed gentleman is Dr. Zola. He's or Rabbi Zola. He's our executive director. He teaches American Jewish history on the campus of Hebrew Union College. To the right of him is Kevin Prophet, who was our senior archivist for many, many years, just retired in 2017 after 37 years with us. And that's me with shorter hair, pre-pandemic hair. And we're giving a tour to a gentleman and really talking about the wonders of our collection, which we're constantly uncovering. You know, we kind of rely on our researchers who are really going in depth in our records to tell us, you know, what they find, because we have millions and millions and millions of pages of pieces of paper, and we can't possibly know what each of them contains. So, you know, it's really a joy to work there and to work with the researchers who come in, because their interests are so varied, and they inevitably find treasures that they teach us about the American Jewish past, and in turn we teach others. And that really is, I think, the importance of archives and Jewish archives. There's so much bad information out there, you know, with social media and television and internet and everything that's out there. I think people get a lot of bad information. And I see archives and the preservation of our history as, you know, a place where people can go to get authoritative answers, you know, and really, you know, and people come to us, right? We're busier now than ever. Every day we get research questions from people around the world. And our job is to try to answer them using the resources that are available to us, all of these millions of documents, and not only making them available to them, but also trying to help them understand what they are and why they're significant. And that's, I think, our biggest challenge, but also our greatest achievement, in that we can do this for people, and we are a resource. And you know, as far as I know, we're not going anywhere. So I hope we're a resource to people for many decades to come. And again, you know, the more people know about us, the more they'll know to contact us and reach out to us. Specifically with the history of Black Jewish relations in the United States, we have a very rich collection. And again, if you do have the opportunity to come to Cincinnati and visit us, I'd love to show you some documents that we often pull out. But I wanted to tell you about a collection, one particular collection, and that is the papers of Annie Nathan Meyer, who was a Jewish woman in the early 20th century, who was one of the founders of Barnard College, the college for women in New York. And her first African-American student was Zora Neale Hurston, the famous Harlem Renaissance writer. And at the archives, at our Jewish archives in Cincinnati, we have preserved the letters that Zora Neale Hurston sent to Annie Nathan Meyer. They struck up a friendship, and they wrote these letters back and forth, and they're just beautiful. They're really lovely letters. And, you know, we have researchers, scholars who want to study African-American literature, who want to study American literature, come and use these letters. Of course, we have lots of material from Dr. King. Dr. King was friends with many rabbis in the Reform movement and in other denominations as well. And so he would often give talks at congregations, at synagogues. So we have audio of him preaching to Jewish groups, and we have letters. Of course, Jews were involved in the history of the NAACP. So we have those as well. And the list goes on. I could just talk and talk and talk, but this gives you a little sense of kind of the scope of our archive and the richness of the material that we have. And I'm open and welcoming any questions people have.
Thank you, Dana. And I just want to add to what an incredible opportunity I'd finally discovered, not finally discovered, I guess when I was in school, and they would assign a history paper and say, go study what were rabbis talking about during the Civil War, not just looking it up online and finding a printout of it or even put in a textbook, but to actually hold in your hands the handwritten sermon from Rabbi Gutheim of New Orleans. And you'd see not just what he was saying, but you'd look at the handwriting and you'd actually see the type of paper in the folio, and it gives you a fuller picture of what was going on. And then, of course, to read the words and how they were responding at the time. So pretty incredible. I do highly recommend everybody pay a visit. Okay.
And I just wanted to add a thank you for encouraging me to send letters and notes to the archives, to be part of this incredible asset. If many of you know, my dad was in World War II. His letters now rest in the archives, as do some of mine. And I want you to know that Dana publishes or edits the magazine, the booklet that comes out. Yes, okay. You're ready for it, which is an amazing treasure trove of what is in the archives. And the last booklet that came in the mail also came with a booklet from Gary Zola, yes, about yellow fever. You have it ready.
Yep.
And remarks by the rabbi at the time. And I want to let you know, Dana, that I was so impressed with it. I folded his work, and I quoted him in my opinion column for the Chattanooga Times Free Press.
Oh, okay, well, I will let him know.
So, because this information, the history echoes today. It's just an amazing thing. Thank you all for it.
Dana?
Yes,
Dana?
sir.
Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, that will always be embedded in my mind as far as the civil rights movement and the participation with John Lewis at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. There were several Jewish leaders there, and just throughout the civil rights movement, your presence and organizations, a part of the board of directors of NAACP and other organizations.
Yes, we do have quite a rich collection on Jewish involvement in the civil rights. Yeah. Thank you.
Dana, just a quick question. Is there a mailing list or something for the archives that?
Thank you for asking. I've included in one of the chat boxes, I did include my email address. So if you would just send me an email with your name and mailing address, I'm happy to get you on to our mailing address, and that would let you know about webinars that we do. We actually have one coming up next week. We could also send you our journal if you're interested, and that's a journal in American Jewish history, and it comes with all these articles, wonderful articles, and that's free of charge. It goes out to 6,000 people and libraries across the country and in Canada and Israel as well. So happy to do that.
Super, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Does your facility have a theater?
A theater?
Mm-hmm.
No, we do have a big electronic classroom Although we haven't had theatrical performances there, but I suppose we could.
Well, the chapel has hosted concerts before, but it's really not it's not a large theater by any stretch of the imagination.
No. Why? What are you thinking? You have something in mind?
Well, I'm a playwright, and a piece that I wrote actually really does spotlight the relationship of African Americans and the Jewish community. So
Oh.
one of my goals, hopefully, is to somehow, some way, get this play produced in Tennessee.
Well, and so keep me posted because we're working on we're coming up on the bicentennial of a Jewish presence in Cincinnati. So we're working with a lot of arts. We're working with the arts community here in Cincinnati, and it's a small community, so everyone knows everyone else. So if you ever want to get in touch with people, let me know.
Christine, I just want to keep in mind Mizpah congregation. We were supposed to host last spring a performance of Parade. The UTC's theater department was going to use our sanctuary as a staging area. So we are open to letting our sanctuary be a theater for appropriate productions.
Oh my goodness, well, we definitely have to talk about this.
Chris, there's an excellent play group based in Knoxville called Word Players, and they do a performance every year for Black History Month. For example, I attended, and they travel around the states to an extent. A couple of years ago, I attended one they did called Walk, Don't Ride, commemorating the Montgomery bus boycott. So I think if you just look up Word Players Knoxville, you could find them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Bessie Smith Hall here, Cultural Center. John, it has a stage, does it not?
That's where the Word Players put on this play that I saw.
Ah.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions about history, the archiving, preservation?
I have a question, and that is, what are the archives in Cincinnati and the Bessie Smith Cultural Center doing during this COVID period?
Well, they are taking the opportunity to organize their book collection and their library, and to automate a lot of things that had not been done before. And that's one of the big things they're working on now. They have received some good contributions from area corporations and Lyndhurst, and just for that, to do just that. And that's what they're busy working on now, archiving everything.
Yeah, we really see this as a very important moment in history, and we are working as an archive and then with other archival institutions in the country and also in Israel in preserving the records of Jews and how they're responding to this pandemic, because we don't want this stuff to be lost. So we're trying to be very proactive now. It's difficult because we are all working from home and we're not kind of there in person, and we're also not working 40 hours a week because we're at home taking care of children and our parents and so on and so forth. But I can tell you that we're not only just looking to the past, and as I said before, people are sending us their records and going through their attics and their basements and boxes and stuff, but we're also trying to look in the present as well. And we're currently working with another organization, George Mason University, that already has a wonderful digital pandemic archive where you can go and see how different religions in the United States have responded to the pandemic, religious groups. They're developing a website where people can go to see, in case they have their own documents or their own, things that they would like to have preserved, a kind of a portal to where it should go. So for example, our archive will be listed there. the American Jewish Historical Society archive will be listed. The Jewish museums around the country will also be listed, because sometimes, you know, for example, someone contacted us recently and said, you know, my son had a bar mitzvah, and so we not only have the programs for the bar mitzvah, which was entirely online, but we had these funny pandemic t-shirts, you know, made up for the bar mitzvah to kind of give to his friends. And so she said, well, would you like one of these t-shirts? I said, no, but it is an interesting, you know, product of this time. And so I put her in touch with one of the Jewish museums who would kind of preserve that sort of material. So we're constantly in conversation. I was on a big committee this past summer, last summer, 2020, developing these ideas and developing the website and ways to tackle this kind of large project. And of course, our regular everyday, you know, day-to-day jobs, we're trying to do those as well. So we're busy.
I think there's a good question from Susan Popula for everybody about the history of our relationship and how we're going to better leverage it going forward. Leslie?
Organizations like this one, what we're doing now, is what Carter G. Woodson thought about that would happen, and we're doing just that. I guess we need more organizations like this one to come together and talk about, you know, our accomplishments, our problems in the past, and the direction that we're going now, which is I think is far better than the past.
I would say that, you know, one of the challenges that archives have nowadays is to kind of, you know, if we think of archives as memory houses, and this is something that I address in my essay in the current issue of the journal, if we really think of archives as memory houses, then what memories are we preserving, and which ones are we forgetting, or we're leaving out, you know? And we want to be as inclusive now more than ever. You know, we really want to think about diversity, inclusivity. We want to make sure as many voices, different voices, varied voices, the voices of the previously unheard people are being preserved. And so that's a serious, and that means also revisiting our past and not only making it triumphalist and looking at the positives and looking at the good things, you know, and the good relations that we had, but also looking at the bad and the ugly,
right?
And really having the serious conversations. And so archives want to be part of that conversation. And I think that's really the challenge that faces us now. And
I think part of this particular group started because there was a recognition that for some reason there developed some sort of gap, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't let that gap progress, and that we focus on the unity that we've had set in common over the years.
Right.
I know a local news station was trying to do a story, and they asked me a question. I don't even know if I gave the right answer, but they said, why do you think there's been such a strong historical tie, especially during the civil rights movement, between the Black and the Jewish community? And my on the 1 foot answer was basically, I said, it's this feeling of being an other in the society in which you live. And I said, there is a drastic difference. The Jews came to America to escape tyranny and still were basically classified as an other that had to become established. And the African-American experience here is the opposite. They came here and forced under tyranny. And but the common thread is that as our experiences here grew, we both experienced that feeling of being a stranger in a strange land, and having oppression. So despite our different histories, there's that common thing, and that we can be united around a cause and see each other, those common struggles. And I think that's where it came from. This feeling that to fight for justice is to say, I know the pain of my brother and my sister, and to say I want to help ease the pain of somebody else, and work together for it. And
But I also think, I mean, I think you're right. I think it is the commonalities, but also an appreciation of the differences, that there are fundamental differences in that history, and to really sit down at the table and discuss them openly and honestly. And I think that's
right,
equally, if not more important.
a refusal to be complicit too.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think that's key, especially, I mean, both sides recognizing the differences, but also the commonalities, because a lot of the time when people are othered, they're othered separately and each is pointed to as the cause of each other's problems. Whereas the ideal, as the history that I don't typically hear about, which is being illustrated today, is that people have come together in the past. And the query then is, how do we do so going forward? And I think what you're doing is a starting point, but how does that spread more broadly so that people recognize that one is not the cause of the other's problems, and actually they're stronger, better, more successful together? If that all makes sense.
Definitely.
One thing that I feel strongly about is that we can't rest on the successes of the past and let those speak for us, that we need to have successes of the present and the future.
The work is ongoing.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Ardina, and one of the things I would also add is that there's just so much. There was so much. I recently was watching To Serve with Love, and I remembered how at the end of the movie, when Sidney Poitier was going off in his marriage, how they kept going, "This is going to be rough on you," and it goes, "Just think about it. Things may change." And I kept going, "We're living in that future." And things aren't getting that great. So I think sometimes we need to kind of review where we came from and how we may be, in a treadmill sometimes, and how we're gonna get off that treadmill by understanding what our past may have been, may change how we may need to make sure we understand how people identify, how they come to the table, what is, how do we look at what's going on and not blame the person who has no control, who doesn't make the policies that redlined my neighborhood. Let's make sure we understand that our history has been untold in many areas. Some people try to avoid it, and we just need to make sure we get our hands out and are ready to dig as deeply as we can, so we can make a difference.
I think, I feel like I'm speaking to people who already have an interest in history, but I think one of the challenges, and I implore all of you to, find the young people and find the people around you, and have them get interested in history and have them become students of history, because it's really important. You can't be a game changer in today's society and not know about the past and not study the past. So, again, we're already convinced. this group knows it. It's finding those other, the people out there and telling them how important their history is and the history of this country is, and not dismissing it, because
it's
we're going to be the losers then.
The idea of having a dialogue is something that was in fact discouraged between the Black and Jewish communities. But it's impossible to build a relationship unless you understand, one, who you are, and then who's the person that you're talking to. And what is it about that person that you may have and find in common. And I remember when Deborah began this process of renewing one of this dialogue, one of the things that we shared was that this is the only time this has ever happened in the past. I think John mentioned Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. There's a history here, but you won't know that unless you have an opportunity to actually learn of it, study it for yourself so that you can understand, okay, I've been told about these things, but now that I understand them personally, my foundation in participating in the dialogue is that much stronger. And I think that's what's important. I think John also mentioned, my old philosophical friend, Sly Stone, said, the way you go depends on where you've been, in part.
And that's why I think, you know, an archive like ours is a place to start, right? And if anyone, you know, has questions, or you want to find a book, or you want to find a resource, you want to find something for a young person or any person, you know, that's what we're here for. And we can, you know, shoot me an email and say, hey, Dana, you know, I've got someone who's interested in reading about this, about, you know, Jewish history or Black Jewish relations. What do you suggest? And I can suggest some books and some articles and things. So, you know, we really want to be here as a resource to people.
I think today is Frederick Douglass' birthday. Am I right? Is it today?
Yeah.
Day and
Valentine's Day. That's
yes, and he's one of my favorite heroes. And I remember his story as a child, that the mistress was teaching him how to read, and when the master came and saw it, and he grabbed a book and he slung it away. He said, "Don't you ever teach," he used the N word, "how to read, because if you do that, you can never make a slave out of him." You know, but it also in the same instance, if we don't learn things like you're talking about, we can never proceed. We can never go forward if we don't study our history, and we can never move forward like we should, or as quick as or fast as we should. Yeah.
And oftentimes, right, oftentimes it starts with the personal, right? It starts with your own family history, your own, where you come from, but then it kind of grows, that interest grows, right? Oh, what about our non-relatives and our members of our community and members, you know, and then it goes from there. And so it's
well, I'm just
small.
hoping the next step is that in general education, that it's more recognized, the correlation between our backgrounds, you know, because it isn't taught. It's not taught in elementary schools, and until you get to college and you decide you're going to take a special class or something. It's just not taught, the correlation between the two cultures and our backgrounds, and really how much we have in common. And as an African American, I'm an adult learning about the Jewish culture. And it's like, why is it taking me to be an adult to learn about the Jewish culture, and really how much we have in common with each other? I mean, and it's always been in the background, oh, we're not supposed to have much in common with Jews. And you know what? I never understood why, and I still don't. I still don't get it. I need it explained to me. Why are African Americans and Jews supposed to have an issue with each other? I don't get it.
Divide and conquer.
Could I comment
Divide
on that?
and conquer.
Oh.
That's
Now we're getting
really
into the
what it's all
juicy
about.
stuff. Okay.
Divide and conquer. I think Rabbi mentioned it, you know, early on, that that dialogue was discouraged because we would find out how much we have in common with respect to being subjected to oppression.
And then probably because we would have combined together a long time ago and been super powerful in this country, because we recognize how much we really do have in common. And then the opposition would have been, oh my goodness, look at this big entity that has discovered how much America has oppressed them. And maybe that's what's been the fear.
Now, Christina, you just email me and I'll send you some sources to read, because it's complicated. This history, the history of Black Jewish relations in America is a complicated one.
It's not all peaches and cream. I would say part of my estimation, and the historians can tell me, because I'm just, you know, I took a few semesters, is that I think we tend to try and teach history as it's very chronological and it's categorized. I think John, you said, right, Black history is taught as Black history, and they'll have a chapter on Jewish history, and then there's a chapter. Whereas history is much bigger than just that, saying a simple statement about it and putting it into one textbook, one particular author's synthesis of all of these things, and that you have to be able to step back and look at a bigger picture of things. And I think that's where continuing to just change our mind about what history means. You know, I think I was in HEC in graduate school studying to be a rabbi before. They said history is not about memorizing dates and places. It's about understanding the trends of how things go and how we interact with each other.
It's the history of relationships on a basic level, really.
My
There it is.
teacher in high school said, if you don't like history, it means you don't like people, and I don't have time for you.
Yeah, you know, one of the intersections with respect to what John pointed out earlier is that Cotton Mather, who is one of the pillars of the Puritan thought in America, was a strong advocate for slavery.
Right.
You know, and that whole underpinning, not only from an historical perspective, when you look at the theological history, this guy's a villain. But you won't hear that.
No.
You know, from people who don't know and understand all of the history that underpins that. And yet we see, in the context of that relationship between this person who was enslaved by him, coming up with something that, you know, imagine if he had been a freed person, given all of the support, encouragement, and resources necessary. What else might he have come up with?
And William, he was a prominent figure in the Salem witch massacres, the Salem witch burnings as well. Yeah.
Christina, just one example, this is probably one of the things Dana will send you some source on, but in the mid-60s, there was a really high-profile conflict in the New York City school system between that involved the teachers union on one side and a substantial number of people in the community on the other side. And most of those people, or many in the community, were African American, and many of the teachers were Jewish. And it was over the question of community control versus the union scope of authority. But that's an example of the fact that sometimes group economic interests or professional interests have diverged, even though both groups may have been allied in important struggles and been outsiders.
Thank you. And it probably is an even more controversial topic to explain what Farrakhan has to do with everything.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
That'll be another session.
I would point out and observe that no relationship, even a good marriage, is not without its friction points.
There you go.
You know,
and to add to what Bill is saying, I think as my spouse, but I'll tag on to what he's saying. We're not in the same room, but let's just go there. But one of the biggest things that I've been learning, and has been really powerful for me, is that it's kind of following the anti-racist education that we've been getting from Ephraim Kendi, is when you're dealing with, my mindset now has been changed to liberation. I want liberation for everybody. That means liberation for me and anybody else that's excluded. And when you're dealing with liberation, there are a lot of ideas. And sometimes the racist ideas that are coming from, even though may come from a particular group, they can also come from my group. I can have anti-racist ideas. I can have racist ideas, which aren't good, which may have, come up from some wrong thinking, but I can change them once I recognize what they are. Like if I'm going to be dealing with a group that isn't going to have the wide tent, that's my issue. I need to make sure that I'm asking, why are we trying to exclude somebody? Because if they're going to exclude them, they're going to come up and exclude me. So therefore, I think the issue is, even though it's about relationships, we also have to understand it's what people are thinking, and as I said earlier, how they identify. Because I think some of the problems that we may be having is, how can you have a Black Jewish conversation when you have some people that may not want to show up to the table as Black, who are Black but don't want to identify as Black, and then some people who are Jewish but then may not want to identify if they have to identify between, am I showing up as a white person first then Jewish, or am I showing up as a Jewish person first? And that's me. I could be wrong in the words I'm using, but I hope I'm trying to make it
Well,
clear.
one of the things to observe also is that, a good grasp of history provides context for any conversation you want to undertake, because some people, as you say, may identify a certain way, but some people may have a skinny notion of history because they don't know all of the facts. They don't understand the context in which certain events occurred. So they come at the conversation from a skewed perspective. And that retards dialogue. And what we want to do is to encourage dialogue.
And I think that with technology, that we're looking at a lot of people getting information from strange places and not necessarily accurate, especially our young people. And
Wikipedia is not your friend.
it isn't.
Or the 1776 project.
So
Right.
we're going to have to consider the next generation very strongly. When I did Holocaust education, a class at a local high school not long ago, I asked the kids why they were in the class, because it was elective. That was the only way that the Holocaust was being taught. And one of the kids said to me, well, I wanted to hear both sides of the story. So you have to wonder, what was the other side that they were hearing? And I think that this is the reality that we're facing these days, that we don't have as much control over what people are seeing as history as we would like, which means that we kind of have to make even more effort in terms of education and reaching that generation.
I think somebody mentioned Farrakhan's. Farrakhan. So I'm gonna take the liberty to mention Malcolm X. It was something interesting that he said I ran across, and I'm paraphrasing him. He said that history is a subject that is best suited to reward our research. I thought that was a great statement, that this subject, it was the best subject to reward our research. That's how important history is. So we continue to study it and debate it in this dialogue about history, we can only be rewarded for it.
That's a nice one.
Deborah, if I might jump in quickly, and thank you for inviting me in. If any of you felt like the Lone Ranger, I'm not Jewish and I'm not Black, but I love people. And you mentioned something a few minutes ago, Deborah, talking about perception. And something I learned a long time ago is we almost need to treat perception as reality until we can prove otherwise. And I think with Gen Z coming along, the most technologically advanced generation we have ever had, these folks, even the older ones, by the time they were 10 or 11, were on an iPhone or a smartphone. So they don't accept things. They're going to immediately start to research. And unfortunately, most of the areas that they would choose to research on don't always have the facts. So what do you propose be done for this new generation?
That's a very good question.
Very quickly, we are running basically out of time, so let's make this the last question, and then we'll we'll sign off.
I was just going to briefly comment and say, in relation to that whole thing about information sources, and to some extent in the question of what we're going to do, a crucial concern that I have, and it's not just with young people, is a lack of critical thinking. For people to be able to obtain information from whatever source, and for people to know how to analyze it, to really think about it and say, does this add up? Does it sound right? What further information do I need to confirm it and otherwise? And that relates to, fortunately, in relation to young people, what Deborah was saying when she went to school, that school, fortunately, you could argue that maybe they were doing that because they wanted to have the other side of the story. So it's that critical thinking that I believe is crucial going forward.
I think I just, Susan, I'll agree with you that when all the information in the world is at the tip of your fingertips, you take the first thing that you find, and instead of going into a library and looking at the number on the side of the book and then seeing all the other books on that same topic, people just take the first thing and they accept it as fact, whether it's Wikipedia or some other source. And it's the young people are not responsible for it, but they're certainly, because everything is right at their fingertips, not doing enough checking and double checking.
I would just add that, it takes a village. I'm seeing this so much in the pandemic, right? I mean, the education of our young people is not just the responsibility of the teachers, it's the responsibility of us all. And we have to have the serious conversations and ask the tough questions and be tough on them, because, they're going to be the leaders of the future, and responsibility to help them.
Conversation is one of the better means of course correction.
But William, it's also a lost art.
Conversation, you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's become a lost art.
We're working on it today, I think.
Yeah.
I agree, and I wish we had more time, because I think we're just getting started.
We'll come back in March. I think we're looking at, Deborah, you can confirm with me, we'd be looking at March 14th.
Correct.
Okay, which is
I don't
also
know, Craig,
like
maybe
savings time. Be careful.
maybe once the pandemic is over, we'll have a big road trip to Cincinnati.
Grader's ice cream. You're buying.
There you go. It was
Chili
nice meeting you
five-way.
all.
John and Dana, we can't thank you enough for being here today. And
My pleasure.
My honor to at least just have a part in this important dialogue. And thank you from everybody around the world for participating in this and for expanding each other's knowledge and making us all think. So have a great rest of the Valentine's Day. And I hope to see you all again soon, either on Zoom or hopefully in person.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation, Deborah.
Pleasure.